This past summer, my son has gotten into BMX racing, and he started off on my Hutch from the 1980s, but it didn't take long to realize that if he wanted to be as competitive as he could, he needed a modern BMX bike. So I thought it would be fun to make a video that shows a retro BMX bike like my Hutch that I got in 1982 versus a modern BMX bike. Now, BMX racing is more of a niche sport compared to other forms of cycling, and I realize most of the people that subscribe to my channel are mountain bikers or even road or cyclocross riders. However, I still thought it'd be fun to do this video even though it doesn't have a lot of relevant bike buying information. So let's take a look at a retro and a modern BMX bike. So here is my Hutch that I used to race BMX on, and the only thing that's not original on this bike is the tires. I put these Maxxis tires on because the other ones were completely dry rotted. Everything else is original from the 80s. And this is my son's Chase Element modern BMX race bike. We're going to look at some of the different components and see how they compare. The first thing that I'll point out is back in the 80s we used pads on the top tube and the crossbar and the stem, and if memory serves me well, I think it was actually required by BMX tracks back then. Today they don't use pads, so there are no pads on any part of the frame. I guess most of the pads are just on the rider themselves. And let's take a look underneath this stem pad because the stems were a lot different. This was a quill stem, so it had threads on the fork, and then you used this kind of wedge that went down inside the fork to hold the stem in place. Whereas modern BMX bikes today are similar to modern mountain bikes in the sense that they use threadless headsets. So there is no quill stem. The stem comes around the fork and you have this top cap and you've got the stem clamp bolts just like you do in a modern mountain bike. Something else that's pretty interesting is how low the seats are run today. So they run them all the way down as low as they can, whereas back in the 80s we ran our seats higher, so it was a little bit more functional. But the nice thing about this Chase Element is the fact that it does have a quick release, so you can raise the seat post if you wanted to use the bike for kind of riding around the neighborhood or to the store. You could raise your seat up, but when they're racing today, these seats are slammed all the way down. You'll also notice how low the top tube is, so it really slants down. There's not a lot of space between that down tube and the top tube, whereas on the 80s Hutch over here, we have more of a separation. The top tube is a little bit more straight and a little bit higher. Let's take a look at this bottom bracket from the 80s, and I think this was a bullseye bottom bracket. So this is a three-piece crank, but it used this bottom bracket that was kind of revolutionary back in the day, and it had these three bolts that kind of held it in the bottom bracket shell. The bottom bracket on this Chase Element is pretty much just a standard threaded bottom bracket, and that's again what you see on a lot of mountain bikes today. Also, the bottom bracket on the Hutch is a square tapered bottom bracket. Hard to see in the video, but it's basically four-sided, and you had to use a special crank remover to get the cranks off. So the cranks just pressed on these, and it was pretty common in mountain biking up until about 15 years ago, and fortunately we moved away from these square tapered bottom brackets, but you know, they were a little bit of a pain to work with. The bottom bracket on the Chase Element uses, I guess, a spline. I haven't taken the cranks off, but the cranks here are very similar to Shimano. I'm not real familiar with this LSP brand, but just like a Shimano crank, you've got two pinch bolts and a top cap, so you can just use some Allen wrenches to loosen those, take off the top cap, and it slides right off, so you don't need that special crank remover that you had to use on those square tapered bottom brackets from years ago. These are the original pedals, and these did not have any pins. Some pedals back in the day, like the Hutch Bear Trap, had these, I don't call them pins, I would call them spikes. And they were pretty dangerous, but they really held your foot into place. This bike came with pedals that had pins, and a lot of people who run flat pedals will run a very similar style pedal. However, once you get into the intermediate and expert classes, you can run clipless pedals, and that is what most people run today for BMX racing. Two things that I'll point out at the rear dropout is you do have an Allen bolt here, which makes adjusting the tension of the chain a lot easier and removing the rear wheel. And you also have these chain tensioners. We didn't have these back in the 80s. So we had just a standard sliding dropout, but you didn't have the chain tensioner, and the chain tensioner really makes it easy to get the tension of the chain perfect. And you can see we didn't have Allen bolts. We used these bolts that used just a 15 millimeter open-ended wrench. The Allen bolts are a lot easier to work with. This Chase Element has a carbon fiber front fork, which I think is really cool. So you're starting to see carbon fiber on bikes, on BMX race bikes today. And the last thing that I'll point out is probably the biggest improvement on modern bikes, and that is the brakes. BMX bikes today, you do see a few with disc brakes, but most of them have the V brakes that were real popular on mountain bikes back in the late 90s, early 2000s. And these have so much more power than the old brakes that we used in the 80s. So these cantilever brakes that we used back then were just horrible in terms of stopping power. I mean, I get on this bike compared to my son's BMX bike, and it is just night and day difference with the stopping power of the new V brakes. And by the way, the weight of this Chase Element is 20.75. That's 2 pounds lighter than the Hutch. The Hutch was like 22.8. So there we go, a fun and trivial video of comparing a modern BMX bike versus my retro Hutch. Thanks for watching.